Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Ask the Expert webinar. How do I make a SAS macro? My name is Tiago de Souza, and I will serve as your moderator for today's event. Now, I would like to take a moment to introduce our presenter, Allison Saito, a senior technical training consultant here at SAS. Allison teaches data preparation and dashboards at SAS Education. Although macro and SQL programming are her favorite topics to teach, visual analytics is quickly becoming another favorite. Allison lives in North Carolina and enjoys adding usable size pockets to clothes. Why don't we turn things over to our presenter so we can get started? Allison, please take it away.
Okay, thank you, Tiago, and welcome everyone. So my goal for us today is to give you a quick introduction to the SAS macro language so you can get an idea of what is it and what are some of our basic core capabilities, and how would I recommend developing our programs so that they use those core capabilities. And the way a lot of people think about writing a SAS program is that you've got some .SAS file and you submit it to the computer and it compiles and executes. And honestly, that way of thinking can get us pretty far, especially if there's not much or there isn't any macro element to it. But the thing is, if we have macro elements in our code, we can essentially have a helper part of the computer doing find and replace for us. So I'll talk about our macro helper as the piece of the computer that is going to find pieces of macro code and replace them with other bits of text that we've specified. So we could set up a program, so it's a title statement, revenue from somethings, and then that gets replaced, so that blank gets replaced with puffs. And I like to explain the SAS macro language as fancy find and replace. For a while, I just said it's find and replace, kind of like in a word processor. But one of my colleagues pointed out that really it can do more than just find and replace. So if you look at the example here, we've got puff in proper case, so the first letter is capitalized and subsequent are lowercase. And then the second instance, puff ends up in all uppercase. So it's find and replace, but a little fancier. So when we find something, we can replace it with text that we've been given, or text we've given to the computer, or text that a function has been applied to. We could also have it replaced with a value that was calculated and stored by SAS. You can also get into if then else to control what text is even put in under different conditions, and we can add loops. So what is macro? It's essentially a way to get the computer to do find and replace, but fancier, on our programs before it compiles and executes them. So I've got a demo where we're going to transform a static program into a macro. And let me switch what we're sharing so that you can see my enterprise guide. So a little bit of adjustments. At this point, you should be able to see my enterprise guide, and I've got a program started for us. And when you're building a macro program, it is a best practice, which I kind of wish I could require of people, but you do what you want. You'll see why I recommend this though. It is a best practice to write your program with nothing dynamic, everything hard-coded in, and then go back and add those find and replace elements. We strongly recommend doing this for ease of debugging, because technically you can debug the find and replace and the ultimate code at the same time, but it adds a level of headache I am not going to recommend you take on. So let's see what this program does to start with. This program is going to run a proc SQL step to create a table work.snacks. And work.snacks has a column for month based on the existing date column, product, and revenue, which is the sum of quantity times price from SAS help.snacks. We're looking at only the rows where upcase of product contains pretzel, and we're grouping by month in product. So if I run just this proc SQL step, we will get the revenue by month for each product. And in my where clause, we have upcase product contains pretzel in all caps, so that pretzel could appear anywhere in the product name. The product could just be named pretzels. It could be named pretzel rods. It could be named twisty pretzels. As long as pretzel's in there somewhere, it will show up or will be selected by that filter. Another thing to point out is that using the filter that I specified, pretzel can be capitalized different ways in the underlying data. So sometimes you've got pretzel with a capital P, sometimes you got pretzel with a lowercase p. But because we're using the upcase function in our where clause and then comparing it to pretzel in all uppercase, the original capitalization no longer matters. It's brought along into the output data, but for the comparison, it doesn't matter. Once that table is made, I'm going to make a line chart showing revenue over time for each of the products that contains pretzel, where the name contains pretzel. So our title is Revenue from Pretzels, and it's making our series grouped by product. Notice that in my title, we still have the word pretzel again, but we made it plural. We put an S at the very end. So ultimately, I'm going to want my report to be dynamic based off of different values that I'm searching for. So I want it to be able to look for like pretzel or puff or pretzels, and it will find all of those. And ultimately, it's able to make this graph for me. So I want to be able to search through the snack data, look for snacks that have some word in their name, and then graph accordingly. And right now, we've done step 1, which is hard code it. Now let's do step 2, which is going to be make it dynamic using a macro variable. So I'm going to make a macro variable. And the macro variable is our most straightforward find and replace. So for this, let's call it search word. And I'm looking for pretzel. So this essentially loads up that the macro variable search word, whenever it's found, will be replaced by pretzel in all uppercase. So then I can put in ampersand search word wherever I want that to be found. Please notice that if it's inside of quotation marks, it needs to be inside of double quotes. So now if I resubmit the code, it runs this time from using pretzel. And if I look at my log, I get a warning about fonts. I'm not concerned about that one. But this is not as nice as it could be. For one thing, my title just said pretzel, not pretzels. So how could I get around that? We're going to use what I call the disappearing delimiting dots, or disappearing, if I can remember, dividing dot. So that is the period. So that dot is used to divide ampersand word search and the S, and then it disappears. So if I rerun this, now I get pretzels, and it's getting better, but my capitalization is still not what I'd like it to be. I'd like to use prop case rather than all caps. Prop case being the first letter of every word is capitalized, all other letters are in lowercase. So I can use a function to do this. But with macro, functions are going to look a little different, because you might be thinking, if you are a data step programmer, you might know that there is a prop case function in the data step. The thing is, the title statement does not directly support the prop case function. So if I run this as is, it's literally going to show prop case, open parenthesis, pretzels, close parenthesis. If I want the macro facility, that is, I want my find and replace helper to take care of that for me, I'm going to need to put it inside of %sysfunc. So now %sysfunc gets my find and replace helper to do the prop case function. And let's actually show exactly how this will progress. So essentially the find and replace helper will see %sysfunc of prop case on ampersand search word, and it'll replace ampersand search word with pretzel. So remember, order of operations, you always start in the innermost parentheses. So you got ampersand search word becomes pretzel in all caps, exactly as it was written up here. Then the function runs and it transforms pretzel into pretzels. Though at this point, I actually don't need the period because the parentheses were doing the dividing for me. So I'm going to remove that. If I wanted to leave it inside the parentheses, that would work, but it's not required because the parenthesis already divides itself. So any of these three statements on lines 23, 24, or 25 end up being equivalent, since ampersand search word is the same as pretzel, thanks to our macro find and replace. So let me comment out lines 24 and 25, rerun, and prove that it's the same as having revenue from pretzels hard-coded from the beginning, as far as the output's concerned. This is a bit nicer because if I have like puff instead of pretzels, then I could rerun the whole thing and it'll search for snacks that have the word puff in them, and it'll put out for puffs. So you've got the revenue for cheese puffs, hot spicy cheese puffs, and wow cheese puffs. You may also be thinking, okay, but right now, puff, or whatever my search term is, needs to be typed in all uppercase. Can we make that more robust? I really don't want to have to remember to type that into all uppercase. Or maybe I'm going to give this to someone else and I know they're not going to remember. Absolutely, we can do that. So what we would do is take our reference in the where clause and put it inside of %sysfunc upcase. So %sysfunc is going to force our find and replace helper to run the upcase function on whatever we gave it. So we could have it input some wonky combination. And let's use some comments to show how this would progress. So ampersand sysfunc, ampersand search word would be found and replaced by that funky combination of text. So whatever text we put here. Then that text, thanks to %sysfunc, goes into all uppercase. So if I were to uncomment line 19, it would be equivalent to what it ultimately ends up running for line 17. And let's rerun the whole thing to prove we end up in the same place. We have the same graph being output. The title is still in prop case. Because the adjustments being made to the text are only being made in this one location. If I wanted to permanently change the value, I could do that as well. So I could do, rather than standardizing the capitalization here, let's do a cut and paste. Up here, I can say %let search word equal the result of upcasing the existing search word. Then later on, I just reference search word if I wanted it in all caps. For this example, it doesn't really matter where you standardize the capitalization, though as a best practice, I would recommend standardizing sooner than later in case you have to use it again later. You can say, you know what, from this point forward, I know it's in all caps. And at this point, we've seen the concept of a macro variable. So what is it? How do we use it? It is essentially a way of doing find and replace. You're going to find ampersand, name of the macro variable, and then it'll be replaced by its value. We've also seen how we can use functions to adjust that text. So if I don't want it to be puff and funky capitalization, I can use %sysfunc around whatever function I need to get it into the capitalization that I want. And this gets the job done. I can just adjust line 9 and then run the whole program, and it makes the report that I need. However, we can go a step further, because oftentimes if you're going to need to adjust this value, you're going to have to do it several times. And I'd rather not have my program be, okay, let's do all of this, copy and paste it, and then switch it over to pretzel, and then copy and paste it, and switch it over to yogurt. Why not? Because, well, if I'm making a change, and I'm like, you know what, actually, I want to change the format used in line 15. Now, I would have to change that format on line 15 and 40 and 65 And that's just kind of a pain to maintain. So it is a better idea to have the one copy, but enclose it in a macro definition. So for our macro definition, it's going to start with %macro, and we're going to call this a snack report. The snack report has one parameter, search word. Then down at the bottom, I'll have %im_end, like that's %macro end, essentially. Im_end, snack report. Then I can call %snack report for all the values that I want. Now let's just do 2 for now. So I could have puff and pretzel. And my macro facility will do its fancy find and replace. But this time, it's finding %snack report and replacing that with all of this. And for that instance, our search word is puff. And then we can call it again, and it will replace it with all that text. But this time, the search word is pretzel. So let's run it and confirm it's going to make a report for puffs, and it makes a report for pretzels. And if I wanted to change something to say, you know what, actually I want it to be double revenue. Probably not something you'd actually change, but making a change could certainly happen. Then you only change it in the one spot in your proc SQL. Then both, you would have to update the name here as well in the SGplot. Then it'll be able to make your double revenue graphs. But let's undo that because doubling the revenue is a nice goal, but not something we can do after the fact. But it shows that you would only have to make the adjustments inside of here, and then however many times you're running snack report, it will perpetuate those adjustments. One thing that throws people off sometimes about making a macro definition is that now I've kind of lost a lot of my color coding between the %macro statement and the %im_end statement. So there's a trick to getting that back, which works in Enterprise Guide, which is make a macro that does nothing. This defines a macro named A, and the A macro doesn't really do anything, but this is a trick to restore color coding in SAS Enterprise Guide. But Tricks Enterprise Guide's giving me my color coding back. If you do include that trick, please put a comment next to it. The first time I saw it, the person had not included a comment, and I was just like, I know that macro is not doing anything, but it must be doing something or they wouldn't have included it. So I'll include the trick, but I'll also label the trick so people know why I did it. And now I've got color coding back for my proc SQL step, my proc SGplot steps. And I'd like to take a moment to show essentially how this text transforms after it's been submitted to the computer. Because we've run lines 11 through 37 saying that, okay, %snack report has some text in the background. It's now been found and it's going to be replaced. So line 39 ends up being equivalent to what I've got for 41 through 64. And line 41 doesn't really do anything. Line 43, we've got a reference to ampersand search word, so that'll become PUFF, exactly as capitalized in our reference. And every reference to that will get found and replaced. And any function, actually, I did that wrong because our function standardize it so that search word is then PUFF. So this becomes equivalent to search word is PUFF in all caps. So lines 63 becomes 64. And then 52 updates and 60 updates. And then the function runs and updates 60 again. So line 39 becomes equivalent to, hey, after all of the find and replace helper has done all its work, this proc SQL step followed up by this sgplot step. So here I was trying to illustrate what find and replace is happening in the background. But the nice thing is we can be gloriously unaware of what's going on. All we have to do is do %snack report and put our puff value inside. One thing worth noting, and let me Control Z to put that text back, is that you don't have to have a semicolon after your reference to the macro. In this case, it wouldn't hurt. It would just be like if I had all of this and then an extra semicolon after my proc sgplot. Because the text I've got highlighted is generated by snack report puff. Having a semicolon after it is fine. Sometimes you get in situations where you wouldn't want a semicolon after your macro, but in this one, it doesn't hurt. I would still recommend not putting the semicolon there, just to stay in the habit of it's not needed. So I'm not going to put it there. Now, what if we put in a word that does not appear? So what if, rather than pretzel, I put in pretzels? My output table has no rows. And if I check my log, it's not terribly descriptive. 0 rows, 0 rows red from sgplot, which I suppose actually is kind of descriptive, but it would be nice if I put a custom error message in, which isn't even an error, but just saying there are no rows containing where product contains pretzels. So how could I accomplish this? With a conditional processing macro statement. So what I'm going to do is have %if %then. So you may have used if then else statements in other parts of programming. In macro, you just put % symbols and then the macro facility knows to take care of it. So I'm going to say %if no rows, %then note in log. And this all caps stuff I'm doing, that's just pseudocode. We'll fill it in a second. But this is our goal, so that if no rows, note in log, %else, we'll have the report, the SGplot. So that's my goal. How are we going to accomplish it? So if no rows, well, how do I figure out if there are no rows? Fortunately for us, there's actually a built-in feature of proc-SQL that it's going to create a macro variable called SQL_obs. And SQL_obs is the number of rows returned by the most recent query. So in this case, it's going to be the number of rows returned and placed into work.snacks. So if SQL_obs equals 0, that's there are no rows. Then we put a note in the log. So let me make a comment pointing out that &SQL_obs is the number of rows returned by most recent proc-SQL query. Okay, so if no rows were returned by our most recent proc-SQL query, then we'll put a note in the log. How will we do this? With a %put statement. %put allows us to put custom text in the log. In this case, I'm going to say note, there are no rows with &search word in uppercase product. So if there are no rows, put a note in the log. Otherwise, run the SGplot. To run the SGplot, I'm going to use a %do group so that I can cut and paste this in and say, do this code. So let's run this for snack report pretzels and see the output or see the results. If I check my log, I get my custom note. There are no rows with pretzels in uppercase products. I do not get notes about SGplot because that text about SGplot was never actually sent to compile and execute. For this one, the text that got, let's see how the text is processed. So essentially, it would find line 42 and then process from here. So it would say, okay, search word is going to be uppercase of pretzels, which ends up being, the uppercase of pretzels. And then it's going to look for rows containing pretzels. Then SQL_obs ends up being 0. So 0 does equal 0. So it'll put the note in the log. Else, that does not actually get sent on to compile and execute. Because this was true, that other code essentially doesn't become true code. It just kind of stays as, it gets booted into the ether. Now let's contrast that to if we had just pretzel. Then our search word is pretzel. It does end up having rows. I don't remember exactly. I think it's 3. Or no, it's more than 3. Let's say 37. Big thing is it's a number greater than 0. So then it's not going to put a note in the log. Instead, it'll run the sgplot. And let's confirm this. If I check my log, there's nothing in my custom note, but I do get the report that I wanted. So for this part of the example, we've shown how we can create a macro definition. And our macro definition is snack report. Then we saw how we can do conditional processing. So that is if then else, though in macro, you have to do %if, %then, %else. The percent symbol is what we call a macro trigger. It essentially tells the computer, hey, this part needs to go to our macro helper. So then the macro helper can take care of it and decide what needs to ultimately go on to compile and execute. Then that is everything I had planned for the initial demonstration. So let's first do some Q&A. So yes, Tiago, what are we seeing in Q&A?
Yes, thank you. With that, we will be moving into the Q&A segment of the webinar. All right, Allison, now on to our first question here. Do macros work with imported data files?
Yes. Macro does not care how the data got into a SAS table. If it's a table that SAS can work with, a macro can work with it just as well. Because really, the macro is just going to do some copy and paste on the code that is ultimately created, and then that ultimate code compiles and executes as if it had been typed in by hand.
Gotcha. Thank you. Someone's asking, can you also use the macro name in the work table name?
Can you? Oh, could we change this so that it's not just generic snacks? Could we name it puff or whatever we put in? Absolutely. So then we would just have search word here. And I would need to make sure that I update every reference inside of my macro. So this example will end up making a table named pretzel. Let's confirm. Output table, yep, is named pretzel. So thank you. I like that enhancement because then you can hold on to your intermediate tables if you need to use them for anything besides that one graph.
Thank you. Someone's asking, is specifying the work library for outputting snacks data set that is created by the SQL code just good practice?
So specifying the library is not required. And I wouldn't necessarily say it's good practice, but it is my habit because it helps me remember which library is going into. Also, then it helps everyone else who's looking at my code know it's going in. But I believe the reason they asked this, and to make sure everyone is aware, if we do not specify a library, it will default to the work library. So if I just have create table ampersand search word, in this case, it'll create a table named pretzel in the work library. And let's run this again, confirming. it made pretzel. I guess you can't see which library it's in there, but if I go to my log, we can see it was made in the work library.
Thank you. Another question here. Does using a macro make macro variables unnecessary?
So using the macro makes it so you don't need to have %let statements outside of the macro, because the macro variables are going to be local scope to the macro. So now we would have search word that exists only inside of snack report. So I left the %let statement up there earlier because it wasn't hurting anything, but it was not required to have it outside the macro. So I hope that answers your question, but please type in more if there's something else.
Thank you. Someone's asking, how can macro be used in predictive analytics?
So predictive analytics are not my specialty, but I can say macro can be used in general. And if there's a piece of code that you're going to have to change a little piece of text and rerun, a little piece of text and rerun. So in this case, for the snack report, it was, okay, I'm going to need to change what I'm filtering on. And then I'm also going to need to change the title of my report. And I'm going to have to do that same change many times. Macro can get more complex than that, but at the beginner level, it's if I'm going to have to change a little thing. So maybe you're doing predictive analytics on all 50 states. Then you'd say, okay, let's run it for Alabama. Then let's run it for Alaska. And rather than having to go through and change those filters each time, you could set up a macro to assist you.
Thank you. Let's see. Can macros be used in a loop, or can macros do loops?
Yes, macros can definitely do loops. So if I wanted, this example does not lend itself great to an iterative loop, but macros can do loops. So let's do a simple one here. So I could just say from I equals 1 to 10, percent put into log note, I equals value of I. So here, notice the percent symbols. It's not just a do loop, it's a percent do loop. If you don't include the percent symbol, the computer will get confused. So I'm just going to have it put into the log I is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And for this, I becomes a macro variable, which is why I can reference ampersand I later in my code. So if I run this, we can then look in the log, and I'll see note I is 1, I is 2, I is 3, I is 4, and so on. And of course, you can use that capability in more complex ways. You could also do conditional loops. So we call this one an iterative because it iterates from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, etc. We've got conditional loops as well, do until or do while. Conditional loops are also supported. So let's say %do, %while, j is less than 10. Ampersand j is less than 10. And beforehand, I'll do %let j equals 1. Then inside, I could do %let j equal, and then I'm actually going to have to bring in another function here. %sysevalf is used to have SAS do arithmetic, basically. So rather than having this just be literally 1 plus symbol 1, %sysevalf gets it to say, oh, that's math, treat it as math. So now let's try this. And if I look at my log, we've still got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And you know what? It went through the loop, but I didn't tell it to put anything in the log, so I had no way of, based on my current settings, I wouldn't have known it was doing anything. So I'll do %put j equals %j. Then rerun to show, in this case, j started at 2 because we had 1 plus 1 is 2 was our start. So yes, it can absolutely do loops. You can do conditional, you can do iterative. I showed %do while, but do until is also supported.
Thank you. There's a handful of questions here about %sysfunc. Could you explain sysfunc function in more detail? Mm-hmm. When does %sysfunc execute? Is it when first encountered or when the macro variable is called? And then is %sysfunc required in your second line program?
Okay, so %sysfunc is essentially telling our macro helper to run a function. It will execute at basically as soon as the computer comes across its close parentheses. Thing is, if you have a macro variable inside of it, those are found and replaced, which we officially call resolved. So that will resolve as soon as we get to its last character. So %sysfunc, imagine the computer's reading this one. It's reading along and it goes, okay, I've got a %sysfunc. I'm going to need to have the macro facility run a function. And it's reading along, looking for its close parenthesis. But along the way, it finds ampersand search word. It's like, okay, well, I'm still looking for the end of the %sysfunc. I need to go ahead and run this first. So it'll resolve it to whatever we had. So maybe puff. Then when it gets to the close parentheses, it will run the whole thing and put it into uppercase. And this is done while the text is still being processed. So if we are in, say, the title statement down here, this adjustment is made before the title statement executes. Because the computer, as it's reading this, will be thinking, okay, I've got a title statement. And okay, we've got some text for the title statement. And then when it sees %sysfunc, it goes, okay, in addition to having a title statement, I have a %sysfunc. And the %sysfunc will finish when I get my close parentheses. The title statement will finish when I get the semicolon. So it's going to move along. It gets to its close parentheses first, so you end up with like puffs. So then the title statement will run with puffs in place when it gets to the semicolon. Follow-up questions on sysfunc and its timing.
I'm sorry, Allison, were you asking if there are any follow-up questions about sysfunc?
Or yeah, does anyone have a follow-up question? Are you seeing any in Q&A there?
Not currently, just those. We had 3 for sysfunc.
Okay. And also, this is very much the quick intro. We do have a full course that goes through basics of macro programming, and that's 5 half days. So seeing it all in an hour, hopefully at this point we can kind of follow along with what's happening. But if you were to ever take that macro programming course, they would have you start typing out, building it for yourself.
Gotcha. Thank you. I guess there's one question that just came in about sysfunc while we're on the topic. They're asking, is sysfunc also used outside of macros?
So %sysfunc is specific to the macro language. I'm not aware of it being used anywhere else.
Gotcha. Thank you. Is there a maximum number of macros you can have in your program?
Not that I am aware of. If it were to exist, it would be in the thousands. So functionally, no. So I believe it's only limited by the amount of hardware you have available.
Gotcha. Thank you. Someone saying, earlier you were making a point about semicolons and you put 2 semicolons after a run statement. Could you go over that point again?
Yeah, happy to. So the point I was making is that for this %snack report, it doesn't need a semicolon at the end. Why does it not need a semicolon at the end? Well, because this ultimately, once the macro facility has done all its find and replace fun on it, ends up being equivalent to this text. So this %snack report ends up being equivalent to, actually, there's a little bit more I need to make here because we added some more macro variables. But after all of the find and replace has been done, lines 43 to 60 end up being equivalent to what we called on line 41. And this is kind of the beauty of macro, that we can call up something much more complex from a single statement. And if I were to add a semicolon after this, it would just be like putting a semicolon at the end of the equivalent code. So adding the semicolon here on line 41 is just like adding it after everything else. It doesn't hurt anything because having an extra semicolon after a run statement doesn't hurt anything, but it's certainly not required.
Thank you. Another question here. Can you show how to cycle the macro through both pretzel and puff concurrently?
Ooh, in 5 minutes, I'm not sure I can, but what I would do is we would have to restructure this so that rather than having search word come in, it would be search list. And then we would have essentially a loop. And in our loop, we would say, okay, let's do a comment, grab word X, or grab the ith word from search list, then run report for ith word. How I would actually probably do this, now that I think about it, is I would probably keep snack report individual, like have a macro that does just one, but then I'd make a second. So I'd have %macro snack report list. That calls each. So let's do some comments to describe how this would be. So I'd say, make a loop over words in products list for each word, run %snack report. And how do you make that loop? that gets more complex, I would probably use our %scan function, which allows you to grab like the first word, the second word, the third word, and go from there.
Gotcha. Thank you. Someone's asking, is macro still useful with SAS Via, or is it outdated?
So macro is still useful with Via because Via still has our compute server so that you can do basically SAS 9 programming inside of Via. It can also be useful with CAS because it's just doing find and replace on the text before it gets processed for compile execute. So if I'm not currently connected to a CAS server, but if I had like, I don't know, proc CAS util load data equals ampersand table, I could still have a macro variable here. So say table is ashelp.cars, because that find and replace would happen before the instructions get sent to CAS. That said, if you're a CAS-L programmer, there are some really nice ways that you can basically do text manipulation outside of macro. So you have alternatives there. But I would say macro is still a powerful option for SAS programmers, including SAS Via programmers.
Perfect. Thank you. I'm afraid that's all the time we have for questions today. On behalf of myself, Allison, and all of SAS, we really hope they enjoyed today's webinar. Thank you all, and have a great rest of your day.
Yeah, take care, everyone.